Okay, now we're on Lab 10 Exercise 3. This might be a bit longer. I'm just going to work through this one, see what happens. Oops. But, so, what are we going to do? For this one, we basically want to set a high and low range and then enter a number. And if that number is in the range, then the value can remain that we set. If the sample is outside the range, then we're going to set that sample and overwrite it to be the midpoint of the range. So if our range is 0 to 10 and we put in an 8 will stay in there. But if our range is 0 to 10 and we put a 100, it will put the mid-range of our range, which from 0 to 10 would be, say, 5. So it would enter a 5 and overwrite the 100. So yeah, so we'll start. So the first step is to set a range. So I'm going to make another exercise. I got to disconnect first. I'm just going to make another program, rename it exercise 3. Yeah, so we can open that, have our blank program. So the first step is to set a high and low range and a sample value. So we can have the range inputted from the HMI if we want. Sometimes it's easier to start with a screen design so you kind of know what's going to happen. So that's what we'll do. Exercise 3. I'm just going to copy some stuff. Actually, never mind. We'll just do it. So we need to enter a value. So numeric entry. And then I'll just put some text in the toolbox. Text somewhere in here, right here. Call it sample value. Or not. Sample value. Okay. Okay. So we're gonna have a sample value. And actually, if we wanted to, let's take a couple more numeric entries and do high range set point, and then this will let us change our range here. Alright, and that's our sample value. So yeah, that's basically going to be what we're going to do. We're going to set a high and low range, and then we'll enter a set sample value. If it's outside the range, it's going to put whatever the midpoint is. So coming back, our first step is basically what we're doing. So I'm going to come back here, and we're going to use a... How are we going to do this? Well, let's just do this. We're going to start with the compare. So if So let's start by doing some math, I guess. Subtract. Actually, I gotta make some tags to start with. Okay, so example 3, high range. Example 3, low range. Call it set point. It's a set point. These are, we're going to use dints. I just default to dint. So that's our range, and then sample set point. So if we look at our screen, we have our high range set point, low range set point, and sample value set point. So let's go back to our program. So we're going to subtract. Basically, I want to find the midpoint of our range. So that would be example 3 high minus example 3 low range, and that will, let's make a new tag. That'll be our range. These could be program or local variables, but I'm just going to stick with global variables because why not? Example 3 range. Value, I guess. I don't know. That's a dint, and we forgot to change this one to a dint. Example 3 range value. So, because this is going to be the value of the range. So if your low is 100 and your high is 200, there's 100 between the high and the low, because we're going to need the midpoint later. So range value. So now I'll just make another tag, and we're going to do more math. We're going to divide. Bring that back down here, and now we're going to divide the range value divided by 2, and that will be, let's make another tag, example 3 range midpoint. That's also a dint. So example 3 range midpoint. So now we have our midpoint, but we will also have to add one more thing. So basically our midpoint, if we had a set point of 100 for low and a 200 for high, our midpoint would be half the range, which is 50. But really, we'd have to add the low midpoint when we overwrite our set point if it's out of range. So if our low is 100 and our high is 200, and we enter 1,000, we should technically overwrite that value with the midpoint of the range, which would be 150, because 150 is the midpoint between 100 and 200. So with this, we would actually be entering a 50. So we basically have to add the low range set point to this number. So I'm just going to do it in the same, save some time. Actually, no, I'll do it the long way, so it's easier to see. So I'll make a new rung, and I'm going to add, and I have to make a new tag too. So EX3 range midpoint overrate. Why not? This will be the value we overrate our sample with if they enter something outside of the range. So how do we do that? That will be EX3 range midpoint plus EX3 low range set point will equal EX3 midpoint overrate. So now we know we have what we need to find the midpoint of the actual range. Now things could get messy if the low range is bigger than the high range. We can fix that, but let's just look and see how this is going to work. So we'll download. Download, yes. So I'm just going to enter some numbers. We'll stick with our 100 and 200. So the low range set point here is 100. High range set point 200. Okay, so 100 and 200, the range is 100, but this is really just for behind the scenes math we're doing. So if we enter a value between 100 and 200, it should take that value. But if we enter a value of 201, it should drop the midpoint, which would be 150. And if we look, we've found the range, divided that by 2 for the midpoint, and added it to the low range set point, basically as the offset, so it would overwrite 150. So that appears to be working. So yeah, so we'll move on to the next thing, the next step. If we go back to our steps, I think we kind of went out of order. Well, not really. We set a high range and a low range. We haven't entered a set value yet. So let's do that. We got to make another tag. No, actually we already have it. We're going to use a sample set point tag. So make a new rung. And I could have put all this on one rung to clean it up, but, or at least make it less rungs. Maybe that's not cleaning it up, but we'll keep it like this. So so let's do a limit. That's what we'll do. A compare. So we have, let's see if this is it. Was there any direction in here? No, actually this limit won't work. Cancel that. So basically, let's compare our, yeah, let's do this. So we're going to compare our set point with our limits. So the first step will be if our EX3 EX3 sample set point, if it's greater than or equal to the low range set point, then new tag EX3 sample is in range. And we can leave that a boolean, that's fine. So, oops, come back here. So if our sample set point is greater than or equal to our low limit, then we're within range. The sample value is in range. Now we also have to put something in here for the high range set point. So that'll be a less than or equal to. So we'll compare it, and I'll just keep it on the same rung. So if our sample value set point is less than or equal to our high range set point, then the sample is in range. So this takes care of the high end and the low end. We have to be greater than or equal than the low set point, and less than or equal to the high set point, and if we are, we're in range. So we can check that if we want. And if we come back here, let this download. So back here, that will be set a high and low value range, which we did, enter a sample value, which we now do, and we know if the sample value is in range, then that value will remain. So if the sample value is in range, we don't have to do anything else. Download. Okay, so every time I download it, it wipes all our values. So I'll just enter them again. High range, we were going with 200. Low range, 100. Close that. So 100, 150 will be overwritten, maybe, eventually. So right now, the sample value is 0, and our range is 100 to 200. So we are not in range, because the sample value here is not greater than or equal to 100. So this rung is not true. So the sample is not in range. If I change the sample value to 100, we can see the sample is now in range. And if I go to 150, we're still in range. 199, we're in range. Now if I go to 2000, no, we'll go to 201, we're back out of range. Okay, so everything so far is working good, except the last step. If the sample is outside of the range, we got to set the sample value to the midpoint setting of the range. So we already did the math for step 4, so this will be fairly easy. Turn that off, make a new rung. So if let's go to favorites. If EX3 sample is not in range, then we're just going to move our example 3 midpoint overwrite value we calculated. Crazy naming. Oh well. Overwrite value, and we'll overwrite the sample value that's entered on the screen. So we'll download that. Download. Download. Close this. Alright, so everything's 0 again. High range, so we'll stick with what we've been doing. 200 for the high, 100 for the low. So our overwrite value is 150. So the sample's in range. It automatically corrected it when we weren't in range. So if I change the set value to 200, oops, I did 20 by accident. You can see it was just overwritten to 150. But if I go back to 100, we're still in range. It can stay at 100, 109, and it'll allow us to stay at what we set as long as it's between our high and low range, which is 100 and 200. And wait, for some reason went to 500. Whoops. And you can see it was overwritten. There's a little bit of delay in this this variable monitoring thing. Anyway, if I go back and try 600, doesn't allow. It keeps bringing me back to 150. Now if I went to 182, it'll allow the value to stay because we are in range. Now if we want to say we got a new sensor or something and the range changed. So now let's change our high and low again. Why not? Or let's just change our high. High range set point. This one can go to 1500. So now the new range is 1500 to minus 100, which is 1400 divided by 2. So our new mid-range point would be 700 plus the low range. So 700 plus 100 equals 800 now. So basically the midpoint between 100 and 1500 is 800. Or close enough anyway. So we're still in 182, was still within that range. If I change it to, I don't know, 1,000. 1,000 stays. You can see we're still in range. If I go to 1234, we're still in range. Let's go to, I don't know, 2. Nope, drops in 1800. So it's working. Basically, if we could simulate on the screen, we could set our high and low. We would have this at, right now it'd be 1500 and this was 100. And if we're between 1 and 1500, the value would stay here in the sample value set point. But if we went outside to say put in a 10,000, it would drop that midpoint overwrite value we made, which is basically the midpoint of the range plus the low set point, and it would dump it in there. And yeah, that's the end of exercise 3.